Okay, good morning, everyone. I'm just going to use this week and next week just for a short sort of a mini. I think last week I think we concluded what I really wanted to share on Rav Kook, and I decided as a mini series I was justified in giving taking a slightly broad interpretation of the title of the series, which is Jewish Thinkers, Their Lives, Times, and Ideas. I mentioned when we began this series that what do we mean by Jewish thinkers? Do we mean who happens to have been Jewish, but their thought maybe was profoundly un-Jewish? And what about non-Jewish thinkers who had an impact on Jewish thought? And the reason I said this was because I did at some point want to speak about Aristotle, Plato, and Socrates and the enormous impact they had on Jewish thought. And I really would just like to use this week and next week, if that's sufficient, to give a little bit of a whirlwind tour of these three figures and try and understand the impact they had on Jewish thought. Now, in Jewish literature, there's an imaginary figure called Aristotle. And the reason he's an imaginary figure is because Jews met Aristotle via the Arabs. In the period of the Gemara and Chazal, in the period of Hashmonaim, the second Beis Hamikdash, middle of the second Beis Hamikdash period, and on, there were Jews who engaged with Greek thinking, but there was no overt, explicit interaction really between them and what we would call Chazal. So in an overly broad generalization, the Greek thought in an explicit and overt and significant way didn't enter into mainstream Jewish thinking. There were very, very important Jewish thinkers in the era of the second Beis Hamikdash who made attempts at synergizing, reconciling this new Greek thought, which was illuminating and enlightening and of great depth, with Torah view. But by and large, they didn't end up in mainstream Judaism. So Alexandrian Jewry may have been heavily impacted in them. And maybe there's one name that is familiar in sort of on the Jewish street now, which is Philo, right? Most people, we don't really know much. The average Jew hasn't really been significantly influenced by these Alexandrian Jewish synergists, those who are attempting to reconcile Jewish and Greek thought. And even Philo, how many of us really thought much about what he has to say? In what way does he really have an impact on Jewish thought? He was a little bit learnt during the sort of 1600s, during the Renaissance, Jewish Renaissance in Italy, where Italian scholars were interested in discovering anyone Jewish who dealt with the Greeks, and then again, more or less disappeared from Jewish thought. So this is a little bit of an oversweeping generalization, but there isn't an overt impact of Greek thinkers on Jewish thought. The Gemara and the Talmud Bavli, Talmud Yerushalmi doesn't mention the word Aristotle, to the best of my knowledge, anywhere in either Shas. And Greek thought is mentioned, it's regarded fairly negatively. The thought of the Yevonim, obviously there's direct conflict in the Hanukkah story, but then after that, Sifra is foreign Chthonium, the external works understood by many to be Greek works. There's Yafta B'Kimli Yafas Yishkan Ba'alei Shem, the idea that the Torah can be written in Greece. There's a recognition that the Greeks aren't quite like everyone else, and there's stuff they're saying that's in some way can be used as a maidservant for Torah, but to the best of my knowledge, we don't really find sophisticated exploration of this. We now enter the era of the Muslim conquest of the Middle East. And the Muslims, after their first wave of sweeping across the Middle East and driving out pre-Islamic culture, discover the Greeks and engage in a project of translating the Greek works into Arabic. And the Jews then begin engaging with this. The Greeks are also engaging with how do we fit in Greek philosophy, which is really human-generated thought, with revelation, which the Muslims also believe in. They have a version of revelation. How to reconcile the two? And in some ways, if we had to summarize on one leg the area of clash, it's really the clash between human reason on the one hand and revelation on the other side. And that's where the general headline is going to be, but then they're going to be specifics. So there are important Greek thinkers that think the world is infinitely old, and that disagrees with a Torah view of a created world and so on. But the real broad brush, really broad headline is revelation versus human reason and how the two should work together. So the Muslims begin engaging with this, and they are followed by the Jews. You have, long before Rambam, Jews that are significantly dealing with this. You have Karaite thinkers that are dealing with this. In our own world, we have Rav Saadiah Gaon in his, he wrote in Arabic, so we can translate it in English, his book of beliefs and opinions, Emunah and Deus, that he wrote. And then, of course, the great figure, the Rambam, who significantly engages with this in a very real way. And they start talking about Greek philosophy. But the figure that they're discussing is a figure called Aristotle, who in a sense is a composite figure of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. And the reason for this is because in the process of works being translated from Greek to Arabic, there was confusion around who wrote what and who said what. And these three figures became, in a sense, merged into one individual. So the Rambam is in awe of Aristotle and speaks about his insight into truth, being near prophetic. He's such a incredibly clear thinker that he gets as far as human beings can, absent revelation, and maybe almost equaling that. And the Rambam dedicates a lot of his time to talking about Aristotle. We now think that this figure, based on modern understanding of who wrote what and who said what, we now think this figure is a composite between Plato, Aristotle, and interpretations of Plato. So Plato himself had students who interpreted him, and that was the work that the Rambam was dealing with. For our purposes, I'm going to be talking about this composite figure, which is how Jews met Greek philosophy, who is labeled by the Rambam as Aristotle, probably more significantly, actually, in many respects, Plato than Aristotle. I will tell you that on a personal level, this is very precious to me, and this is very central to me. I didn't in school. I didn't do philosophy A level. In education, I received a good education in science and history and other areas, and particularly studied philosophy. And I really met these thinkers via the Rambam in Nevuchim, and in yeshiva, in the classic curriculum, which in the yeshivas I went to was Lomdus and Gemara. And only sort of relatively deep into my yeshiva career, began engaging with my own desire to understand and deepen my understanding of Emunah and other areas, began engaging seriously with Moreh and Nevuchim. Through that, met the classic Greek thinkers, and for a time sort of thought I'm probably the only person left alive in the world who still takes Plato seriously. I read sort of a superficial reading of philosophy, current philosophy, in which many of these thinkers are considered to be outdated. I then discovered later on that there's very, very serious school of Neo-Platonists around, and their work in many ways is alive and kicking. It's not just sort of a framework for which modern philosophy is based on and has improved. There are many people that take these ideas very, very seriously. But certainly for me, this was very central to my access or my entry into thinking about these things. Let's just speak a little bit about dates and a little summary of sort of the history of it. So the Greeks had been engaging with philosophy for many hundreds of years before the Common Era. Socrates, we're talking about roughly 469 before the Common Era, through to 399 before the Common Era, so roughly 400 years before the Common Era. Socrates himself, we don't really have much from. Well, it's possible he didn't write much, certainly not much was preserved. We really only know him from his student Plato, and Plato, the student Aristotle. So that's the chain of sort of generations, if you like. Socrates, who altered forever Greek thought. The Greek thought is almost split between pre-Socratic thinkers and Socrates and on. Socrates is followed by many students. There's many versions of Socrates. So when we ask what did Socrates say, we don't really know what Socrates said directly. We have a rough idea of what sort of thinker he was, but Plato's Socrates is very different to Xenophane's Socrates, different to Xenophane's Socrates. There's a number of students of Socrates who report his thought. From a Jewish point of view, we're particularly interested in Plato's report of that. And then in turn, Aristotle is a student of Plato, but who differs with Plato quite significantly. So for the purposes of Jewish thought, the two really influential figures are Plato and Aristotle, and the differences between the two of them. And in many ways, even though we're sort of traditionally told that Aristotle was the more influential thinker on Jewish thought, in many ways, really, it's Plato who's the more significant thinker. So roughly, if we divide them into years, Socrates flourishing till about 400 in the Common Era, Plato flourishing till 347 into 347 into the Common Era, roughly 50 years later, and then Aristotle through to 322 in the Common Era. So that's roughly I think the dates are that important. That's the chain of the Masorah. That's the chain of the tradition that exists in the Greek world. And as I said, we don't really know that much directly about Socrates. Our interest is going to be in Plato and Aristotle. In some respects, the most important insight that sort of remains from Socrates is what they call the Socratic method. This idea of reasoning and question and challenging and proof by contradiction and analysis and sort of the belief in empiricism, in the ability to look at the world and arrive at truths from that, and belief in human reason to arrive at truth. So in a sense, even though we don't know specifics about Socrates, he's an important figure because he's the one that sort of introduces this concept. As I said, the most important thinking is Plato's, which presents. It becomes unclear when you learn Plato dialogues how much is really Socrates and how much is Plato. So for our purposes, we'll just call this figure we'll call the figure Plato. The range of Socrates' interests are enormous. We've once discussed, I think, in a significant way, Plato's dialogues when we looked at the question about the relationship between God, Hashem, or in Greek thinking, the gods, and ethics. We spoke about the Euthyphro dilemma. Does this ring a bell to anyone? Two horns of a dilemma. Is God independent of ethics? Do ethics exist outside God? In which case he's somehow the gods, in which case somehow they're bound by it. Or does God create the ethics, in which case it is arbitrary and what's something ethical? Does this ring a bell to anyone? We spoke about ethics and religion? No? Okay, we have to Chazorah on all of this. Very important stuff. That's really, I think, we've significantly engaged in it. I'm going to jump because, in a sense, I'm less interested in him to Aristotle, and then we'll come back to Plato, who's the one that for our purposes really interests me. So Aristotle. I'm not going to go through his biography. I'm just going to mention some of the areas with which you'll come across him. He's Aristotelian logic. He's famous for his all men are mortal, all Greeks are men, therefore all Greeks are mortal. So in other words, a version of if A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C. If A is bigger than B and B is bigger than C, then A is bigger than C. If his presentation, if all men are mortal and Greeks are men, then Greeks are mortal. Aristotelian logic. He's interested in categorizing. He's fascinated in epistemology, what truth means. He's fascinated by ethics. He fleshes out geology and natural science and biology, and he explores concepts of chance, classifications of living species. He's amongst the first to engage in classifying species in a way that has an impact on the model. Interested in psychology and imagination and memory and personality and ways of thinking. He's in the soul. What is it that makes human beings uniquely human? He's interested in political, how should society live, how should it structure itself. He's interested in ethics, what does it mean to be good, what that we ought to live. He's interested in economics, he's interested in art, what makes something beautiful, what makes something aesthetic. It's impossible to stress the degree to which he's a giant in the formation of Western thought. And when we talk about a Greco-Jewish world or the like, we really his Jesus pins and almost set the agenda for everything that counts as Western. And on the one hand, and on the other hand, his shadow really hung over medieval thinking and onwards in a very significant way. He was such a towering figure that people found it hard to break free from Aristotelian thought. So he both triggered enormous advance in human knowledge and thought, and because he was so overwhelmingly brilliant, it's hard to imagine how someone could encompass so much thought and so much insight and so many ideas in such a profound way. But his mistakes, it's significant numbers of so I'm just muting everyone because I'm getting a little bit of interference here. He made a significant number of mistakes, and that shadow hung over Western thought for centuries. An example, motion. So the idea that irrespective of the weight of an object, it accelerates speed, right? So this is think of the legendary experiments in which Galileo objects are dropped off, and it turns out that they fall at the same speed. It's only air resistance that confuses us. Anyone remember this stuff from your physics, high school physics, if it's not further, right? So these are mistakes that hung over Europe for millennia, really. The big Jewish encounter with this is around the eternity of the universe. So this is the one area where Jews really couldn't budge and didn't budge. And we couldn't go along with an eternal universe. And of course, this posed a problem to the Muslims and the Christians also. And now, as of Einstein and relativity and expanding universe and Hubble and so on, science has really swung the opposite way around. We don't believe anymore in an eternal universe, but the shadow of the sort of weight of the Greek idea of an eternal universe, an unchanging universe, right? Einstein himself, in what he later describes as his biggest error, can't believe the idea that we're in an expanding universe that's the stars are rushing away from each other, because thousands of years, since 2,300 years, believed we're in a static universe of species evolving and going extinct. Aristotle thinks the species are eternal and they sort of exist for all time and all space. So his shadow hangs over European thought for millennia, but it's hard to explain his and how significant an impact it has on later thought, democracy, and there's so many different ways. There are areas of his research that still puzzle us to this day, how he did this. So he has astoundingly incorrect ideas around anatomy and biology and things like that. He also has astonishingly good ideas, sketches of tiny insects where we just don't know how he saw them in such detail and was able to so accurately draw them and the like. So this is the towering figure of Aristotle. I want to really, though, focus on a number of Platonic ideas from Plato. By the way, his real name is not Plato. Plato is a nickname that's given to him. His real name is Aristocles. Plato means broad. We don't know why he's called this nickname Plato Broad. It's tempting to assume it's because he was such a broad thinker, and that may be the origin of his name. It may be because he had a very broad chest and was a very strong person. It may be because he had a very broad head and was a very intelligent person. So we don't really know why he's called Plato, but be that as it may, that's what he's gone down into history as. And what I'd like to do today is just share some Platonic ideas, which I think are very, very interesting and had an impact on Jewish thought. And I want to try and explain, if you like, this impact, the legacy that he left on Jewish thought, and how to think about this legacy. So just to summarize what we've said so far, we've said that there was, from Socrates through to Plato, his student, and onto his grand student, Aristotle, there was a flourish of Greek ideas. We said that Socrates, we don't really know actually that much about what he himself said. We only have him through the interpretation of his students, and therefore, by definition, there's some confusion about what are his students' interpretation and to what revere him. They see themselves as presenting it. We don't know to what degree that's really him. For the purpose of Jewish thought, the key figures are Aristotle and Plato. Aristotle enters Jewish thought, and Plato enters Jewish thought via the Arabs. They become, in a sense, an imaginary merged figure called Aristotle, but we now think actually some of the ideas are Platonic, some of the ideas are Aristotelian. Aristotle is significant, enormously significant in Jewish thought in areas that he has a big impact on the Rambam's thinking around sociology and politics and ethics and an ideal society, because don't forget, Judaism is also about how societies should be run, but in the sort of abstract thinking of theology and our relationship to God, there we now think the more significant influence on the Rambam's thinking is actually Plato, not Aristotle. But either way, the two of them together, and in particular Aristotle, have an unimaginable influence on everything about Western thought and how we think. That's a summary of what I've said so far. What I now want to do is shift to looking in more detail at some of the ideas that Plato said, because that deals with what I want to focus on, which is direct sort of theology and understanding of what it means to be a finite human in a world, which is fascinating. Sorry, Neil.
The one hand is
yes. Yes, so the Rambam is absolutely overt about this. He mentions again and again Aristotle particularly, and Greek ideas, and he's critical of some philosophy and some Greek philosophy, including some groups of Muslim philosophers, and including aspects of Rav Saadiah Gaon's philosophy. And he's very, very positive about other aspects of philosophy. And other than the question of an infinitely old universe, that basically thinks that Greek ideas are very useful tools in understanding Jewish. So he's very open to this. I should mention, by the way, by this point, the pagan aspect of Greek culture is not really that relevant. Meaning, the Greeks happen to be pagans. The Rambam happens to be a monotheist. Very, very important difference. But in terms of what the Rambam is interested in, it's a side detail. He's not going with that. And in truth, Plato is effectively a monotheist, and Aristotle effectively monotheists. So if the pagan elements that they leave in their thought are just around seeing perhaps pagan forces as agents of a monotheistic God, but they've moved to monotheism, they recognize that there's a power that lies behind everything, and it's that we don't know exactly if and to what degree there's Jewish influence on Greek. Greeks are notoriously dismissive of anyone non-Greek and don't really acknowledge much influence. There's some Greek allusions to influence from Jews in reverse. It's possible that, and perhaps even probable, that monotheism trickled through to Greek culture, perhaps via the Jews. But there's not an overt or direct influence that we know about or is easily measurable. But yes, the Rambam and Rav Saadiah Gaon are absolutely, and many are absolutely explicit about that link between the two. Yeah. There's a vast number of thinkers, Jewish thinkers, Orthodox thinkers, if you like. Orthodox is a bit of a ahistoric term, but obviously Muslim thinkers, Christian thinkers when Christians rediscover the classic sources, and all of them are sort of roughly in the same playing field of how do you put revelation together with reason. All of them, and they disagree with each other to a degree also, like philosophers disagree. So Jewish, Muslim, Christian philosophers within themselves, how you reconcile, have different thoughts. The Rambam looms large because he is largely considered to have been the most successful at doing this and the most influential at doing this in at least last Jews in a significant way. But there's lots of this going on. Maybe I just want to emphasize more that, let me actually step back and speak about how a number of ways in which Greek philosophy influences Jewish thought. And then I want to explain that even opponents of the Rambam and opponents even of the philosophical endeavor. So don't forget that there's controversy around this whole attempt to reconcile the two. Even the opponents are altered forever by this encounter with Greek thought. So once it's there, you can never return to innocence. Meaning, even if you're going to oppose philosophy, you can never get it out of your mind, and you always have to grapple with it. And even if you're going to explain why you don't believe in philosophy and don't think it's a useful tool, you're going to have to, in some way, sort of, shape or form, use the language of philosophy to explain that. So once Jews seriously engage with Greek philosophy, they're changed forever. You can never get away from it, and that's and I'll try and explain what I mean by this. Okay, so how first of all, okay, we're Maminim. We believe in Torah, we believe in revelation. So why are we meant to engage with Greek philosophy, and how do we reconcile that there may be insight that the Greeks can offer us? So on one level, there's nothing concerning about that. Revelation is about spirituality, relationship to Hashem, how we ought to. It doesn't necessarily say anything about categorizing animal, classes of biology. It doesn't necessarily even say anything about economic policy, which the Greeks are interested. It doesn't say anything necessarily about aesthetics, art, and poetry. It doesn't say anything about rhetoric. It doesn't say anything about all sorts of things. It doesn't have to say anything about all sorts of things that Greeks find interesting. So on that level, there's not too much of a controversy around using it. To translate into modern terms, even someone who wishes to live the most sheltered existence from modernity isn't going to be that worried about using electricity. Right? So electricity is discovered by scientists. Who cares? Okay, but it's that. In an extreme form, you could even say that Torah is just telling us about our relationship to Hashem and how we are meant to live, how we ought to be, and it doesn't need to tell us anything factual about the world. Except, of course, it does tell us some factual stuff. It tells us about the creation of the world, for example. It tells us about starting age to the universe. So there are areas of factual insight that the Torah does give us, which we're going to have to deal with if we take Greek thought seriously. So we're now edging to slightly closer to home potential confrontations. Then there are areas that Greek thought really sort of begins overlapping with Jewish thought. It's nice to say that we don't say that much about economics or how society, sociology, or politics, but we do, of course, say things around economics and sociology and politics. So it also gives direction around how society should live. There's a Sanhedrin, a court of law, there's Koyanim, there's a Melech. There's models of how society is structured. There's charity, tzedakah, and master kasofim. There's a whole range of things which have some overlap with politics and economics, but even there, maybe not a significant amount. Then we get to ethics and what it is to live the good life. And there you really are entering into territory that overlaps with our interest as Jews, what it means to be a good person. And then there's the more profound issue, which is, at the end of the day, yes, we're humans who received revelation, but we're also thinking beings. And to what degree can we use our reason to know things about life? To what degree can we use reason to understand our place in the world? And what do we do if these two sources of information, reason and revelation, contradict? And maybe actually the two feed into each other. Maybe the way we know that there's God is through reason. Maybe that's how we're meant to arrive at Emunah. And there's, in a sense, almost two poles of narrative that we often don't think about as from Jews in where our relationship to Hashem comes from. We taught about Avraham Avinu, who arrives at awareness of Hashem through his own thinking and his own research. And we talked about Matan Torah, where Hashem reveals himself. Which is the better or deeper or more important way of knowing about God? And you can argue both ways. You could argue, well, surely reason is the better way to know about God. We can arrive at surely that's the best foundation of Emunah. Someone just says, I believe because, okay, I've been taught about Har Sinai. So that's what you're taught about, but other faiths teach about different things. Surely that's not a great way to be a Mamin. You should arrive at belief in Hashem through philosophical reason, and you've probably heard these reasons. I mean, even a very basic one, like argument from design, is a sort of logical or scientific or philosophical argument for God, and then there's more subtle ones, cosmological arguments and ontological argument, that emerge around these ideas. So is that the best way to know about God? Or maybe you can argue that this is all ridiculous. If you meet someone, you don't need philosophy to know about them. I don't need to know philosophy that we've spoken and encountered. We've spoken to each other, we've talked to each other. So if in Revelation we met God, we met Hashem, and He spoke to us, and we speak to Him, then why do you need philosophy? It's not that philosophy is wrong; it's just almost ridiculous. Maybe it's even a bit insulting. If I philosophize about your existence, then something's lacking. We have a relationship, right? to philosophize about my relationship to my parents, or is that love? Is that a relationship? Is that a connection? So we have these two poles of thought, which in a sense is really underlying the whole conversation between the two ways of thinking, Greek philosophy and Jewish philosophy. The problem is that once you've encountered Greek philosophy, you can't rid yourself of these questions. They're there. Once human reason has demonstrated its power and its ability to arrive at truth, you're always going to have to grapple with to what degree do we take these truths seriously, and how far do you take them? You can't remain immune. You can't recognize that human reason has created light bulbs that work and not worry about, well, then maybe some of his other insight is true. So the Rashba cites the pasuk when he talks about encountering Greek philosophy. Kol ba'ayha lo yeshuvin. All those who enter it can't return. There's a no return. Once you begin engaging in this, in a sense, you're there forever. And the Jewish world has entered down that cul-de-sac, and there we are. We can't remove ourselves from this. So this is one part of the encounter with Greek philosophy. And in answer to the question about is it just the Rambam or not, the answer is everyone therefore deals with Greek philosophy. No one can escape its influence. So famously, the Rambam views positively the engagement with rationalism. You have a Kuzari who really writes an extended work in which, to some degree or other, he's arguing that revelation is the better way that Jews should know God. But he's not immune or unaware of Greek thought. He can't be. You have, moving very far in history, perhaps the most profoundly anti-philosophical treatise or thought written in recent times, which is Nachman of Breslov, but he can't help but be an anti-philosophy philosopher. In his very attempt, and I think we've spoken about him before, in his very attempt to fundamentally argue against this whole endeavor of philosophy, he has to use tools of reason. How else? If you meet someone and you want to argue with them against human reason, what tools can you use other than reason itself? And that's the paradox in which you find yourself trapped when you encounter Greek philosophy. So in a few moments, I want to explain also that the Greeks introduce a vocabulary of thought. And this vocabulary of thought permeates all Jewish thought in the most astounding way. So here, even the Mekubalim, the Kabbalists, have adopted language of Greek thought to try and explain the ideas. So even if you're far down a mystical way of thought and overtly and consciously trying to avoid Greek influence and rationalistic influence, the Greek languages, the Greek vocabulary of thought developed is so useful and so good that you can't help but avoid it. And I want to give some examples in a few moments. So just to summarize, once you have entered the world of reason and rationalism, you can't really get out of it. And even if you think there's something very limited and very dangerous about being over-rationalistic, you have to argue your point using the tools of rationalism. And I want to emphasize, by the way, we're not going to explore all of that today because we're really trying to look at great thinkers. There's important reasons why we need to take seriously the arguments against rationalism. First of all, we do believe in revelation, and secondly, there may be very profound reasons why over rationalism is an overly limited worldview and doesn't give you access to truths. So I'm not here taking sides or being dismissive of those claims. I'm simply saying that once you take seriously rationalism, you can't escape its influence. It's there to stay, and that's one area in which Greek thought has an imprint on everyone. And the second area that Greek thought has an imprint on everyone is in the vocabulary it uses. And I want to revisit that, but I see there's a question here. Yes. Yeah.
So is the question, are we comfortable with the idea that the Greeks should have got there first? So why are we not being taught with the very tools we're talking about today? Why were the rabbis not the first to identify if they had a more direct line?
Okay, so the question of so if the Greeks have all this truth, how could it be they got there first, and how could it be we need what they're using? And depending on what you hold about Greek thought will depend on how you answer that question. If you think it's all a diminution of revelation and it's less true than revelation, then you have a very good answer to that question. which is, again, I want to say, if I'm talking to you and I've met you, do I need philosophical proofs of your existence? So it could be that Greek thought is a lowering and a lessening of insight, but that's where we are and we're stuck with that. But really, revelation and classic Jewish thought gives you a deeper access to truth. That would be on the opponents of Greek thought. On the supporters of Greek thought, they would simply say that we have those truths anyway from Torah and from Nevuah, and Greek thought has simply given us a way of thinking more clearly about these ideas, or vocabulary to use that's useful. But in a sense, this is part of what I want to explore. And in the sense, your question is the question, which is, 1 minute, if you know, okay, we're encountering Greek thought, but surely if Torah gives us all truth, why are we learning it? And the answer is going to be because Torah, Chochmah b'goyim tamid. There was never a claim that Torah is teaching us everything there is to know about everything. It's teaching us what there is to know about certain things that interest us, about what it is to live a spiritual life, a good life, to build a relationship to Hashem. And in that area, we have much to offer. It's not necessarily claiming that it has the most sophisticated thought around economic policy or even science and the like. So it's part of a broader discussion that lingers to this day about what Torah is and so on. I think I gave a series a while back, possibly still under COVID, around Das Torah, and we spoke about the maximalist position of Torah knowledge. Does Torah include everything, or is it more limited? So it's around that. I want to make just one of the points around the how Greek thought has permeated the whole of the Jewish world. And in some ways, this will slightly answer your question also. It's important to realize that Jews, in some ways, or some shape or form, did theology long before the Greeks. And here, I want to remind you of something I've said again and again, that, and we spoke about this when we spoke about Cook, actually, most recently, but we've visited this numerous times, that there are, broadly speaking, two ways to get, to this day, to get insight into the world. And we can call them art and science, if you like. Now, if you read Shakespeare, or you look at the work of a great artist, it gives one insight into, let's say, in Shakespeare's case, sociology. It's clear, I mean, a fascinating depth of psychology and sociology. If you look at the work of a great artist, you may understand something more profound about a sunflower or winds or trees than you would have without looking at the work of the great artist. If you read a great poem, you may I don't know what the experience of being blind is like, that you couldn't have had without this great work of art. On the other hand, a lot of the insight of Western thought is categorizing and labeling and specifying. The insights of a piece of psychological research also gives you insight into how the human mind works. So what are these two ways of understanding the human minds? A Shakespeare model, a literature model, and a scientific or research-based model. But what's the difference between the two? And each really offers a different type of insight. And the best analogy I can give of this is one that I've used before. The difference between learning French in the classroom and going and living with a French peasant in the countryside for a year. If you learn in the classroom, you will learn the rules of grammar and you will learn French vocabulary, but you won't be absorbed and immersed in French culture. You won't get the feel of what it is to be French and what it is to experience that way of life. Immersing yourself in a culture, living in it, a strength that's stepping back and sort of metacognition, thinking about it from outside will never give you and can't give you. On the other hand, thinking about something from outside gives you rules and classifications and concepts which can then be extrapolated from and used more consciously. There's two ways of learning about life. Even if any of us think about our experience of learning a foreign language, whether it's French or Spanish or biblical Hebrew, most people, when they learn that language for the first time and they're taught the rules of grammar, and that's really interesting. In this foreign language, they've got all these different forms of past tense. They've got the pluperfect and the part and past participle and so on. It's so funny because in English we don't have any of that stuff. Now, of course, we have all of that in English, but we don't think about it ever, and we just use it because we've grown up here speaking English, and we're just immersed in that culture. To learn the rules of English is very complicated. It's very difficult. We just do it because it's our mother tongue. So being immersed in a culture gives a great strength. In some ways, it's more holistic, more organic, more real, more immersive, less self-conscious, more natural, more fulfilling, but it doesn't do as well when you need to engage in conversation with others, when you need to classify, when you're not immersed in a culture like that, and when you need to extrapolate and extend it. And in some ways, this is the analogy of the change that took place in the Jewish world. When you're living in a completely immersive Jewish culture, you're sort of just Jewish organically. But as soon as you encounter another culture, and perhaps you're living in a less Jewish world, you need to find tools and vocabulary to express it. Not just to express it outwards, but even to express it to yourself. Because you don't speak Lashon HaKodesh anymore. You don't think and immerse yourself in a world of Nach. You're thinking in Arabic or in a European tongue, in foreign ways of thought. And you need now to start categorizing things and labeling them. And with that comes a loss and a gain. The opponents of philosophy would say, with that only comes a loss. The proponents of philosophy would say it comes a loss and a gain. Everyone would agree that in some ways you're losing something. The Rambam would also say in some ways you're gaining something, but it's just a different way of connecting. Pre the encounter with Greek thought, Jews engaged in sophisticated ideas, but they did so first through the vocabulary of Nevuah, which is really, in many ways, is metaphor and poetry and so on. And then later through the vocabulary of Medrash and Agadah. You tell a story in order to convey Jewish ideas. You tell a poem, a metaphor, a legend, a rhetoric. It's a lived experience. In some ways, what the Rambam is saying is, I'm now going to try and translate these Medrashim into the vocabulary of Greek language, of philosophy. So it's a transfer of ideas, which comes with a change, a different way of being. And the Rambam almost makes it explicit. There's often confusion about, did the Rambam see his endeavor as a l'chatchila, as an ideal, or a reluctant accommodation to a non-Jewish world? And the answer is a bit of both. On the one hand, his work is a Moreh Nevuchim. It's a guide to the perplexed. And he writes explicitly at the front, this is written to the students who's encountered Greek philosophy, encountered revelation, and is confused about how to reconcile them. If you never encountered Greek philosophy, don't bother reading this. You don't need to read this. On the other hand, he believes the Greeks have got something in what they're saying, and there's insight in what they're saying, and there's a truth that adds a profundity. And he almost says this explicitly. He says, I believe that if you learn Nevuah, if you learn Agadah, if you learn Medrash properly, you can arrive at all these things, but we've lost it because we live in a different world in which we are using the language of rationalism and reason, and therefore we need to into a different way of thought. But in so doing, things are irreversibly changed. I want to just give another analogy from language, and this is again, I think anyone who knows more than one language reasonably well knows this is the case. That translations always slightly change the ideas. You can't translate from Kant written in German or written in French and translate it into English and expect it not to be changed. Or in our own world, why do we invest so much in kids learning Chumash in Lashon HaKodesh? Why don't we use a translation? Because all translation is interpretation. Why do we try and learn in very complicated Aramaic? Why do we waste so much effort? I mean, there's perfectly good translations available. All translation is interpretation, because as soon as you get into a different culture, something is lost and something is gained. And we want to preserve our way of thinking, so we try and immerse ourselves in the Beis HaMedrash. The Beis HaMedrash is an area in which we can still put ourselves back into that to the degree possible solely Jewish world. So the Rambam is and Jews that encounter Greek thought irreversibly changed Jewish thought. From then on, to some degree or other, all Jewish thought can't avoid being translated into a foreign language. And the Rambam sees the allowance of this, and maybe this is what Chazal meant when they say Yafta Elokim liyapes v'yishkon ba'alei shem. Beauty has been granted by God, the three sons of Noach. Beauty has been granted by Hashem to Yafes, and Yafes can live in the tents of shame. And the Gemara says Torah can only be translated into Greek. And the Rambam understands that it's only a foreign language it's allowed to be translated into. The Rambam understands that to mean that Greek thought is uniquely endowed with the property of, if you have to translate Torah, it's the language that you can translate it into. There's something useful about the vocabulary of Greek thought that allows us to translate Torah into that, but it's still a translation. There's still something lost. There's a Tanis that we don't really speak about much anymore, but mentioned in the list of Tanios, which is the day in which the world was translated into Greek, referring probably to the Septuagint, Ptolemy, the Talmud HaMelech in our language. The Torah translates into Greek. A darkness descends upon the world because now Torah, for the first time, isn't just being learnt by Jews in Lashon HaKodesh, it's being learnt in Greek. I mentioned already there's an earlier Jewish encounter with Greek thought that doesn't leave a significant impact on the Jewish world, which is Alexandrian Jewry. They are probably the ones that begin using the Septuagint, that gain from this Greek translation of Torah. And Chazal have mixed feelings about it. On the one hand, wonderful, Torah is now available to people that otherwise can learn it. On the other hand, what a tragedy, this is darkness descending the world because we're no longer learning Torah, and it's within itself. It's being learned as a foreigner. And to some degree or other, all of us think in non-Jewish. We all think in another language. So my point, though, is that once you've left that immersion, you can never really get back in. As soon as you are thinking that way, I'll come to in a second, as soon as you are thinking that way, you can't avoid it. And the language of Greek thought is all over the most non-Greek works, all over the works that are explicitly out to not allow this invasion of Greek thought into Jewish thought, are still using. There's not really a vocabulary of language that we can use without beginning to use Greek terminology. So just to summarize really the second part of what I'm saying is that Greeks, for better or for worse, illuminate the power of human reason. Some aspect of that is not that controversial Jewishly. Some of it is a little bit controversial, begins treading into our territory. Some of that treads very seriously into our territory, but you can never reverse the clock. As soon as they're talking about these things and thinking about it, we have to worry about, okay, so how does Revelation fit in with that? Number one. Number two, as soon as you have a sophisticated culture that's an alternative to ours, and it becomes a dominant culture and you're living in it, you have to worry about translation. You have to worry about how do you think in both languages? How do you, I don't mean literally language, I mean, even if you're speaking in Hebrew, you're still, in a sense, using the vocabulary of the Greeks. How do you adopt that mindset and how do you respond? And even if you make an attempt to rid yourself of Greek influences, you're still on some shape or form only able to do so on those terms. And finally, I'm emphasizing is not that Chas v'Shalom Jews don't engage in sophisticated theological thought, pre-Greeks. They absolutely do. And anyone who learns Medrash and Chazal and Haggadah sees the profundity of their thought, but it's a completely different way of learning. And in some ways, the most non-Maimonidean is really also, in some shape or form, entering into Maimonides' territory, because he says, I'm going to show you the depth of Haggadah, and he'll draw out ideas and concepts from Haggadah, but in so doing has to use the language of reason and philosophy to show you that. So he'll take a Medrash which appears to be mystical or fantastic and show how it's carrying deep truths, but those deep truths are still said to us in the language of the Greeks. So Judaism is irrevocably influenced by this, and primarily by these great thinkers that we're going to try and talk about a little bit still today, and then next week, Plato and Aristotle. So yeah.
Would there have been that process as we met? Now,
solution of those lines is a halachic process. To what degree is it influenced? Very interestingly, so halachic reasoning is very, very, very sophisticated and abstract, and Jews did that long before their overt encounter with Greek thought. While they're more subtle ways of influence of Greek thought on Jewish thinking, we don't think so. We don't think so traditionally, and academics don't really think so. But it's impossible to answer. But when you're learning Mishnah and Gemara, you're learning very, very subtle reasoning. And as far as we know, emerging from a culture which is quite far from Greek influence. So the Persians, Bovel is under Persian rule at the time. Persians are anyone who remembers their history, are fierce opponents of the Greeks. They're at this stage trying to overtly avoid Greek influence. We don't think there's significant influence feeding that way, but it remains a question. So there doesn't seem to be in classic halachic thought an influence. And to this day, there seems to be less influence of Greek thought on halachic process than there is on the sort of philosophical process. A lot of discussion why that might be, but that seems to be the way it is. I want to comment briefly on one extraordinary culture, Jewish culture, and even in a sense use that to show how much Greek thought permeates. So the first Jews to encounter Greek philosophy and deal with it in a significant way, the first mainstream group, again, there's Jews in Alexandria, but they haven't left an enormous impact on, as far as we understand, on what we would call orthodoxy. But the first Jews that are part of mainstream Orthodox thought are the Gaonim living in post-Islamic conquest of the Middle East, Rav Saadiah Gaon and others who grapple with philosophy. They are then, this then is transmitted into the North African and Spanish medieval world of Rishonim, and it is them primarily who engage with Greek thought, the Rambam most famously, but many other Spanish Sephardi Rishonim. In the meantime, in North France and Germany, you have another very, very, very vibrant Jewish culture, which is the Ashkenazi world, and they are not then Christendom. They're not the Christendom in the 1000s, 1100s, who don't really have much influence of impacts from Greek thought. When does Greek thinking enter Christendom? Only really with the early stages of the Renaissance, and on when the medieval world rediscovers Greek thought, rediscovers the classic Jewish classic antiquity, and they begin translating madly from Latin and Greek into other languages, and often aided by Jews who have come by the Arabic. So Europe really first encounters Greek philosophy via Latin translations of Hebrew translations, of Arabic translations of the original Greek. That's sort of the chain of how it goes. Later, they get their own access to it, but a lot of it is brought over by increased contact between the Muslim world, and Jews are often the bridge in translation. And that's when Ashkenazim begin engaging seriously with Greek philosophy. In a sense, Ashkenaz preserves, in a way, the more classic way of Jewish thinking. They're engaging in very, very sophisticated thought, but they're still using the language of Medrash and the like. And that's why you see in the Ashkenazi world, Medrash carries on as a sort of pursuit. And there's some contact between the two. So the Rambam is aware that in North France, the Ashkenazim don't really know much philosophy, and he's not that impressed by that. The later generations who think that the Maimonideans have gone too far and want to begin swinging the pendulum back turn to Ashkenaz for support in that. And by the time you get to sort of the Rambam and the Rashba and degrees of opposition to philosophy, they see themselves as the students of the Ashkenazim, and the Spanish and North African world begin swinging the other way. So there's a pendulum of thought going both ways. Enter the beginning of the Renaissance in the more developed areas of Europe. So you have the Ramah in Krakow, who really is a Maimonidean and writes philosophical work, and Maharal and all that generation, and sort of Maimonidean thought begins permeating the Ashkenazi world also. What's interesting, and with this I will conclude, is even in the Ashkenazi world, very, very far from the centers of philosophy, you see significant inroads of Greek thought. And this is really, really interesting. And I'll simply leave you with a bit of homework, which is the Hasidei Ashkenaz. Look at their beautiful, exceptionally beautiful poetic writings, of which the most famous is Anim Zemiras. But if you open your Yom Kippur Machzah, after Mariv, you will see Shirei HaKavod, Hymns of Glory, which are Anim Zemiras type text of lengthy, beautiful poems. And you will see them replete with Hebrew translation of Greek terms in ways of describing God. So the Hasidei Ashkenaz is a pietic movement which emerges from Ashkenaz, quite far from Greek influence, and yet even they are struggling to find vocabulary to describe spirituality and God without resorting to some philosophical. You then move forward into, for example, Hasidus, which sees itself as quite immune from philosophical influence, and it's Kabbalistic, and it's opposed to philosophy, and yet the very vocabulary they use is replete with philosophical terminology. So that concludes what I want to say today. Next week, I'm going to simply just describe various words, and I'm going to explain what they mean in the thought of Plato, how the Rambam used them, and how they've become used in sort of modern Jewish thought in a manner in which maybe some of the practitioners aren't even aware that these were really philosophical terms introduced into Judaism. And you'll see how endemic they are, even in schools of thought which are really non-philosophical, but the degree to which they can only explain non-philosophy in the language of philosophy. And I hope that will give a taste of how, for all Jews, these are important Jewish thinkers, in a sense. They're not Jewish, Plato and Aristotle, but they have stuff to say that has irreversible language that we use to express classic Jewish ideas, even if not the thought itself. So that, please God, will be our project next week. Good morning.
the reason for that probably were worried about Hellenistic.
Yeah, absolutely.